use case against Fi. It doesn't hit. It's not nearly as bad for Fi, but it is effective, and you will see these Oldhim players play things like Chokeslam against the Fi decks.
Right.
Zach finally utilizing his armor, the Crown of Providence as well. We'll see if he opts to filter a card. This is going to be a block for 7.
Yeah, the armor's finally coming out to play for both sides. This is a big block here. He's going to not use the... Oh, wait. Oh, no, it looks like no use of the trigger here. Both these players getting a little closer to being naked and afraid.
Yeah, I mean, Pete is in just a fantastic spot right now. Zach
absolutely.
does go up to the 3rd counter on the Tunic with a 3-card hand and Snapdragon Scaler is available. But Pete's sitting at 9 life with a Stalagmite, 1 block on Creative Verse, and a block on Fjendal Spring Tunic available.
Yeah.
This is where you want to be as an Oldhim player.
So it looks like we're going to start.
In my last video discussing Valiant Flesh and Blood, we mostly talked about the raw numbers of the game, what's typically expected for attacking versus defending values, how those numbers change, and which ways you can start to push the overall math of the cards in your hand. Today we're going to talk about another aspect of that, which is going to be something that's typically overlooked, but armor. Armor is really important because it essentially can take the place of a card when it comes to blocking. While armor itself often have activated abilities sometimes, you can also value them based on that number as well. Going into Welcome to Wraith, once again looking at the original alpha set to get an idea of where the baseline is, we see a lot of legendary equipments that often block for 2 with Blade Break, or sometimes block for 3 with Battle Worn 2, letting you block for 2 the first time, and then block for 1 the second time with the -1 counter. There's also some of the common equipments which often range in a scale of 1 to 2. For instance, we have the Iron Rot suite, which all block for 1 with Blade Break, and then we have some more offensive equipment like Goliath Gauntlet, which can buff something by 2. So once again, we see that fundamental push like from Wounding Blow, where on average, offensive values are going to be higher than defensive values. The main reason why is because if defensive values are too high, then you reach a point in the game where it's always better to be blocking with cards rather than attacking with them. And that's how you get some pretty stale game design, like pure fatigue decks that just look to block out and utilize the overall better defensive values versus the offensive values. It's typically much better if games end with a winner through combat damage. So we see that fundamental being pushed here, where you're always going to be incentivized to be attacking more often than defending. How should we use equipment? This is a topic that's been covered a lot of times, and so I'll just sort of contextualize it for the conversation of value. So like what we talked about last time, you have a card like Snatch, for instance. If your opponent ends their chain with Snatch, they have no cards left in hand and no card in arsenal. And Snatch is on average going to be worth anywhere, let's say between 3 and 4 value, because the card that they're going to get to arsenal is now a card that they can use and play with on their following turn. And so because of that, if you're able to block Snatch exactly for 4, you deny your opponent having above rate card, because if Snatch hits, let's say on average we value the card that they get at 3, then in essence they had a 0 for 7 in that one particular instance. Of course, Snatch can be a more useless card, and it can just be a 0 for 4 if your opponent already has an arsenal and they end their chain with Snatch, which is why we talked about in the last video about how a lot of times Flesh and Blood feels like a push and pull of you and your opponent trying to go above rate and you either denying them that or achieving it yourself. If your opponent attacks with Snatch in an effort to gain a higher turn cycle value than you, and you're able to deny them that effect, then in essence, you can sometimes actually be above rate yourself in the exchange. Looking at armor, we can see something like Snatch. The issue with Snatch, of course, is that it's tricky. It's on a break point. Most cards are going to block for 3 unless they're a defense reaction or you have some other effect that's buffing the defensive values. And so what makes it difficult is that if you actually want to block Snatch out, you have to block with 2 cards. And let's say on average you can be blocking for 6, right? So your opponent actually made you waste an entire card, an entire extra card, in order to deny them the on hit for Snatch. And that's where equipment can really come into play, because let's say you blocking for 6 on that Snatch is going to be putting you down on value for the turn cycle. Maybe your turning hand isn't that good, or maybe you took damage previously in the combat chain and now you're over blocking and wasting potentially 2 more block that could have been put somewhere else, right? Because you could have blocked for 3 on something and then blocked for 3 on the Snatch. You take 1 from the Snatch, but in essence you got 6 value from the defending value of your cards. And if you took 3 damage somewhere earlier in the turn to then block 6 on the Snatch, you just let 3 damage go through much earlier when you could have blocked that as well. So it gets tricky. But armor can come into play as a way to help you not have to make that poor value exchange. And so you're able to block with maybe a piece of Iron Rod equipment right at the very least, or potentially in other classes you have these better defending equipments, but you're able to block Snatch with only 1 card from hand if you choose to do so. While your opponent maybe puts you in a tough spot, puts you on a tight decision point threatening to go above rate on the turn cycle, you were able to shut it down with the permanents that you have on your side of the table, which are going to be your equipment. The equipment are such an important and interesting part of Flesh and Blood. It's one of my favorite design aspects of the game. It's what really draws me into it. I love the math that goes behind like the things that you get to start with on the table, when you choose to use them, how you use them. It's really important, and you really got to know the fundamentals for it. So let's actually look at one of my games from about a year ago. This was during the original skirmish season back when Viserai was still legal with Scaletta, and this was actually my first, I think, large tournament win, something that was higher than an armory. I was able to win this skirmish, spoiler alert. But let's take a quick look here at what I do on my opponent's first turn. So I went first to deny Viserai the ability to have a very strong starting turn, right? If Viserai is able to potentially make a couple rune chants and pass, then they've gotten free value on turn 0. Where normally, you can block out damage on turn 0, and it's kind of like an even playing field going into the second turn. Someone like a Runeblade, you're able to make rune chants, which stay for the following turn, and so that sense you can start to break the math a little bit. So I chose to go first to deny my opponent that option, and you'll see here my opponent opens up with Yellow Mavrian Skies into a meet and greet for 4 with Go again. What's important here is that the Mavrian Sky says that if the attack hits, my opponent's going to make 2 rune chants. And so what's very interesting about this is I actually choose to block with Skullcap before taking damage this game. We're both currently at 20, and if I took any damage, I would be to lower life total, and I would be able to block for 2 with my Skullcap. If we think about it, Skullcap at its best value is going to be blocking for 3. If I take damage, I go to a lower life total, it's going to get +1 with the Battle Worn, and I can block for 2 with it. And if there's ever another point in the game where I'm at lower life, I can block for 1 with it. So the best possible value on Skullcap is 3 life. If I let the meet and greet hit, my opponent makes 2 rune chants with the Yellow Mavrian Skies, and I basically took 2 extra damage. And so what actually happens here is me blocking with a 3 block and Skullcap essentially lets Skullcap block for 3 immediately, because it blocks for 1 to prevent the meet and greet from hitting, and because it blocked the meet and greet with the Mavrian Skies, it prevents 2 rune chants from being made. So that's 2 potential life or 2 potential damage I didn't even have to think about or deal with. I also didn't value the High Octane as an offensive card at the moment. I had one in Arsenal and my hand was very expensive. It was a 1 cost and a 2 cost, and High Octane really only gets good value when you're able to pair it with 0 cost, and so I wouldn't have actually got anything extra. And so I was already planning to block with that card on that turn cycle, and so getting to essentially block 6 with 1 card and a piece of equipment was huge, right on the spot on my opponent's first turn. And if my opponent ever does drop me super low, I am able to block 1 more time with the Skullcap, so I essentially got 4 life out of that equipment, as opposed to 3, which would be the normal stat line of the card, at its best, of course. I am planning to hit my opponent back really hard and do as much damage as possible, and there's actually a chance that I could be in a life total lead, and Skullcap may never even get to 2, and so taking the opportunity immediately to not have to block 6 on that meet and greet, while also getting to deny 2 rune chants being made, let me come out ahead in that exchange over those 2 cards. My opponent traded 2 cards in essence for 4 damage, and I only had to use 1 card to stop it with my armor. And so just because of that, you can start to see how armor is super flexible and makes up for some of the math in the game. Breakpoints are really tricky to work around, and armor is a really good way to make that not an issue, until of course once your armor is gone, and so you really need to be careful and decisive when you choose to use it. Of course in Blitz it's a little bit easier since the games are much shorter, especially during this time, during Everfest, and so you take the first chance that you can to cash in on armor value. Finally, to wrap this up here, we're going to talk about armor as a replacement to blocking the cards in hand when it comes to actually being dealt lethal. This is also a really important use for equipment, as sometimes later in the game you actually want to be keeping full hands, or you need to keep certain combinations of hands to either present lethal to your opponent, rip their entire hand, or potentially push for the game itself. And the only thing that can often come in conflict with that is of course being presented with lethal from your opponent and being forced to block with cards. And so armor can be really important for actually getting to keep an extra card in hand essentially. They can prevent you from having to lose an entire card to an effect that your opponent's playing. And the reason why I say lose an entire card instead of blocking is the assumption is that that card is much better on offense and you need it yourself to close the game out. Sometimes when you present your opponent with lethal, and if you make them maybe even have to lose 1 or 2 extra cards, if you come in with a really big attack at the end, or you have a go wide turn that presents lethal, sometimes your opponent is often trying to keep cards, depending on the deck, that are much better on offense. We could look at something very simple like Scarf, for example, right? This card is noticeably worse defending than attacking. There's a 2-point value difference between blocking with a card and attacking with a card. there's very few scenarios where you would actually actively want to block with the card. And so for instance, if we can make our opponent have to block with it, then we have actually made them lose even harder in the value exchange, because now they had to get 2 value out of their card that could potentially be worth 4 on offense. This is really important. You'll see this a lot where late game, someone has a 4-card hand or something. It could be any number of cards and the opponent attacks for lethal, and the opponent has been patient and saving equipment, and the player just slams all the equipment in front. We call it the fridge. They maybe go to 1 or something like that. They play on this really tight margin, this really small threshold, and then they get to keep their entire hand or whatever number of cards they needed to then sometimes present enough to end the game, or present enough that they rip their opponent's entire hand, even if their opponent still has equipment left, and then they get a 4-card hand that's undisrupted, untouched by the opponent, and then sometimes that's enough to snowball into a victory. So equipment can also be worth a lot when it comes to not actually being forced to lose cards from your hand. And so that's a little bit more difficult to quantify because it really does depend. But for instance, if you have a piece of equipment, let's say that could block 2 in that instance, instead of you having to block for 2 with your Scar for a Scar, not only is your equipment preventing 2 damage, it's also letting you play your 0 for 4, and now your card is above rate as opposed to having to block for 2, which would be under rate for the defense value. So it's just one more thing to keep in mind. So hopefully this video was helpful. It's another quick reminder that Saturday, March 4th at 9 a.m, we're going to be spoiling our Outsiders preview card. Really excited for this, obviously. It's really great to be a part of another spoiler season, and I hope to see you all then. So until next time, thank you for watching.